A little bit about me. I have over 20 years experience working in corporate communications, working with global leaders, including Microsoft, Accenture, Dell, and in the Irish marketplace, more recently with Bank of Ireland. And I specialize in aligning reputation management to commercial strategy for global organizations. And what that means is I protect and promote corporate reputations in what is an increasingly complex global marketplace. So today we're here to talk about reputation and reputation risk. So what is reputation? And reputation is what others think and, more importantly, say about you based on your past actions. And there's a well-known saying that reputation is built and not earned. And the reason is that it's based on how a company behaves. And this is really important because trust is at the heart of corporate reputation, and trust is commercial. So we buy from, we work with, and we work for organizations that we trust. And when the trust is lost, an organization's reputation suffers. So reputation risk then is the gap that exists between what our stakeholders expect of us and how we actually behave as an organization. And we've seen this probably most, as one of the most high profile examples we've seen of this in the past number of years is Facebook, who've been through a number of issues and various crises because stakeholder expectations and customer expectations of how their data is being used is not actually what's happening in reality. And I think we're probably all familiar with footage of Mark Zuckerberg looking deeply uncomfortable addressing the US Congress. So this is the risk we run when our actions don't meet our promises as an organization. So how do organizations actually manage their reputation? So it operates on a spectrum, and when things are going well, most organizations are active, they're building and they're enhancing their profile, so through their marketing activities, public relations. And when this is going really well, stakeholder trust is at an all-time high, stakeholders are engaged, and sentiment is positive. And this is actually measurable because your brand scores will be high, your employer brand may be high, and generally it could even be represented in your share price. On the other end of that spectrum is when things are going wrong. And we generally categorize this as issues management and then crisis management. And they differ in that issues management is when there is a threat on the horizon and an organization is actively managing and monitoring that threat in order to minimize the reputational damage that will attach to them. And this can be, a number of different issues. This could be preparation for an announcement maybe an organization is going to make. It could be operational changes. Maybe you're reducing your workforce, or you could actually just be changing your pricing and you're going to charge customers more for what you charged them previously. And in those situations, you'll be working to minimize reputational damage insofar as possible. But then there's the full-blown crisis. And this is where an organization is under threat and they're fighting to protect their reputation. And it should be said that crises are not always self-inflicted. So natural disasters, extreme weather events, fires, there's often existential threats to organizations. But what we've seen more and more, particularly in recent years, is how an organization responds to a crisis that isn't of its own making can actually often enhance their reputation. So if you're seen to take care of employees, take care of impacted customers, and communicate effectively through a crisis, then actually you could even come out of a crisis with your reputation enhanced. I want to talk a little bit about the changing landscape that we're seeing, particularly in the last decade. So I have a very, very simple organizational structure up here, very simplified. I want to draw your attention to the stakeholders that are evident here under each of the divisions. So, and generally what happens in organizations is each of these divisions are given responsibility for managing their own stakeholders, and their stakeholders where they have a level of expertise. And traditionally, when it comes to reputation risk, the corporate affairs team has been given the job of managing reputation risk for an organization. And the reason is that in general, a crisis wasn't really deemed reputationally damaging until the media had got hold of it or the press were reporting on it. And then you bring in the media experts to handle that situation. But in the last 10 years, let's have a quick look at what's happened externally. And this is what the landscape for that organization looks like. So instead of investors and regulators and employees and customers all sitting in their neat little boxes, they're actually all rolling around together on social media, because Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook have eroded all the traditional barriers that used to exist between them. And this has had an effect whereby organizations, when it comes to reputational issue, any single stakeholder now has the power, now has the voice, and now has the capacity to feed into and cross-communicate with other stakeholders. And I suppose we now call that going viral, and we all know what that looks like and how damaging that can be. So this is what this now looks like from an organizational perspective. And suddenly the organization is overwhelmed, and there isn't any single group that is able to manage that crisis if all of these stakeholders are involved in the chatter and they're impacted. So the question then becomes, in today's world, from a reputation risk perspective, is how do we come up with systems that address the white space that exists between these divisions and their where they own their own stakeholders? And I always think division is actually a really interesting way to describe how we separate functions within organizations, because it reinforces constantly that we should be separate, we should be divided, and that silos should exist. So even the language we use suggests that these should all be operated separately. But in actual fact, the question now becomes is how effective are these different divisions at cross communication and sharing information as they make business decisions in order to help organizations avoid reputational risk. So how do we do that? And this is what an effective reputation risk management structure looks like in today's world. So we said at the outset, the reputation risk lives in the gap between stakeholder expectation and company behavior. So the first thing you need to do is know who your stakeholders are and what they expect of you. And within an ESG context, stakeholder materiality is actually doing a lot of this work for us, and it is identifying your stakeholders and the risk the business is exposed to, and will ask questions about how well you're actually managing them. So that can actually work harder for you to take a broad view of your stakeholder environment and understand exactly what's expected of you as an organization. And you can then use that to benchmark your decisions against what your stakeholders will expect. Reputation audit is another tool that we use in this space, and that's actually checking and measuring how you're faring, how your reputation is faring with your various stakeholders. And a lot of organizations will use this actually as part of their strategy development, and they'll undertake a stakeholder audit in line with their strategy cycle to see how they're actually faring with their various stakeholders, and are there areas of their business they need to change or they need to tackle in order to close the gap with particular stakeholders. And the third piece within this is threat identification. So again, as something else we've seen with the advent of social media, is issues now are often developing on social media. So there's numerous organizations that will now do active listening, and we call it social listening, and they're tracking and alerting organizations when issues are blowing up. And then you'll often have different divisions around an organization also feeding into this process. And they could be looking at what regulatory changes are coming down the line, legislative, or even in industry changes. But all of this adds up to the requirement to understand your stakeholder environment and what the expectations are of you. Second piece then is crisis management or issues management. And this is the expectation that most organizations have that crises are going to arise from time to time. And this is because natural disasters occur, extreme weather events occur, systems will not always work. They're guaranteed at some point to fail. If you have 1,000 employees, you can't guarantee that they're actually going to behave within company guidelines at all times. So good crisis management involves the team who knows exactly who needs to be involved, when, how they can be contacted, and they can be operationalized at speed the minute a crisis raises its head. And most organizations recognize the types of threats that fall into these categories. So airlines would look at how they manage the aftermath of an airplane crash. Banks might look at what threats around systems being hacked and customers being unable to get hold of their funds, or indeed employee or even board members going rogue, and how you manage the reputational threat that attaches to that. And then the final piece is what we talked about in the earlier model, is embedding reputation risk analysis into the organization. And what this looks like is embedding systems into the organization as part of a governance framework that stress tests business decisions for reputational risk. And as we looked at earlier, the external landscape has shifted. So we now know that any stakeholder group has a voice and the capacity to create reputational issue for an organization. An example of this is Wetherspoons, who are a large UK pub chain. And when COVID hit and the UK went into lockdown, they told employees they weren't going to pay them until the government supports kicked in. And this meant that some employees weren't going to be paid for 5 weeks. And employees were up in arms. They took to social media. They created a hashtag boycott Wetherspoons, and several parliamentarians supported them. Customers were up on arms, and Wetherspoons were forced to change their position and pay employees earlier, but with a lot of reputational damage attached. So what we need are systems in place that allow organizations to look at the threat that arises. So in that situation, Wetherspoons wouldn't have been just looking at the threat that would have arisen from employees, but actually what the reputational risk was when other stakeholders, including political and customers, heard this news, how they would react and how that could impact on the organization's reputation. So reputation risk isn't one that often pops up in the context of ESG. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about why it should sit within an ESG framework. And the first point is that it actually sits within the G. So within sustainable governance within an organization, we're arguing that embedding reputation risk analysis should be in there. So in the same way that an organization will have legal governance framework, or there will be diligence done on financials attaching to any commercial decision, there should also be reputation risk analysis done. And I would argue that this would need or should happen quite low down in the organization. So most organizations might have somebody at either the executive table or at the board who might be a reputation expert. But a lot of times the issues that trip organizations up are as a result of decisions taken way before things ever get to the board. So embedding it into the framework quite early on is part of the sustainable governance approach. The other thing that's happening externally is the legal and the legislative environment is beginning to change. So within Europe, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and this is going to see all organizations with an employee base of over 500 having to report on their sustainability activities. And this is interesting from a reputational risk perspective for two reasons. One is that any organization that isn't living up to its ESG promises or isn't meeting its ESG requirements runs the risk of sustaining reputational damage once the reporting mechanism is in place for this from 2024. And the other reason is that I believe that what we're going to see is more and more reputational risk reporting going into non-financial disclosures like the EU CSRD. And one of the reasons for this is that in the US, we're seeing legal cases alleging reputational harm, where directors and board members are actually being named in legal cases where the argument is that reputational damage has been sustained to organizations because the board or directors let it happen. We touched also on stakeholder materiality. So, and this falls under ESG reporting, and knowing and understanding, as we talked about earlier, your stakeholder expectations will allow you to benchmark the decisions you're making. So keeping your stakeholder materiality as a live document and not something that is just carried out in line with reporting requirements makes it a very valuable tool to help you assess reputation risk as you make commercial decisions. Company culture is something that there's a huge amount of discussion about recently, and it sits under the S within ESG. And inclusion and diversity is something that we often talk about within company culture, and inclusive decision making, where all stakeholder owners are consulted to see how their stakeholders are going to react to a particular decision. Embedding that inclusive decision making within organizations can really help tackle reputation risk that organizations are carrying. And then finally, it's commercial, it's linked to the value of an organization. So according to the World Economic Forum, reputation is valued at up to 25% of market value. So, and we saw this again, just go back to one of our high profile examples, Facebook. When the Cambridge Analytica story broke, Facebook saw 7%, $36 billion wiped off its value in single day. So I'm conscious that we've a mix of organizations and organizational sizes. So I thought it might be handy just before we wrap up, as a director or a board member, assuming your decisions haven't gone through the reputational analysis that we talked about, what are the types of questions that you should be asking in order to ascertain the reputation risk attaching to a particular decision? So first up is the risk register and considering the reputation impact of each risk on the register. So how do you do that? The first question is, well, what stakeholders are impacted? And they're the primary place. But as we've also seen, stakeholders who aren't impacted, like the Wetherspoon customers, they still need to be factored in, and the question needs to be asked, well, actually, how are our other stakeholders going to react to this decision? And if, you know, one stakeholder group blows up, what's the pile-on going to look like? And then the way you do that is you go through the inclusive consultation that we talked about. So the relevant experts within the organization who have an expertise in stakeholders, so investor relations will know how shareholders will react, the PR team will know how media will react, HR will be very clear on employee reactions, and you want to be able to see how they believe each of their stakeholder groups will react to a particular decision. And then we talked again at the outset about the gap between stakeholder expectation and how a company behaves. So a question that needs to be asked is this in line with our values? And if you're an organization that has built, let's say, values on being an exemplary employer, and you're going to take a decision that actually makes working life within the organization less palatable, how is that going to go down, and how can you stand over your values in that context? So the question you're then asking yourself is, does it meet our stakeholder expectations? And if it doesn't, you're going to have to look at how you manage that so that the organization's values don't have to be either amended or changed. A very valuable exercise also to undertake is using external challengers. So a lot of organizations are guilty of groupthink, and it's very difficult to assess what or how a decision you take internally will be received externally. And a lot of reputation risk arises because organizations just didn't think or just didn't consider how a particular decision would go down with certain stakeholders. So having maybe like an external PR team, an external legal team, some more external advisory board, run the slide rule over your decision and challenge it can be a very, very valuable way to assess the reputation risk. And then having done that, you may decide that you are still going to go ahead knowing that there is going to be negative reaction from certain stakeholder groups, and you will have to prepare your defense. So if you want to move ahead with this and you don't want to be in a position where you're having to reverse your decision, then you need to have your defense prepared. And then that gets rolled out in a very, very robust communications plan that involves anticipating the challenges, identifying the individual stakeholders, working out how you're going to communicate with them directly, and heading them off in a way that minimizes the reputational damage that a company attracts.